What would you do if you pressed the call button in first class, gasping for air, and the very people sworn to protect you looked the other way? This is not just a story of turbulence in the skies. It is the story of Dr. Malcolm Hightower, a brilliant black neurosurgeon whose quiet dignity was met with cold indifference. At 37,000 feet, he asked for water. He asked for help. He asked to be seen. And yet, his pleas were dismissed until his body collapsed, leaving passengers in shock and the world demanding answers. Was it negligence or something far darker? Why did his life have to hang in the balance before anyone took him seriously? And what happened next that shook an entire airline to its core, rewriting the rules of aviation forever? This is not just about one man. This is about every person who has ever been told they do not belong, even when they had earned their place. Stay with us, because what unfolds on this flight will leave you questioning not just the system, but the silence that allows injustice to survive. If this story moves you, make sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss the stories that matter. Now, let's begin. The cabin lights were dimmed, a soft amber glow stretching across the rows of passengers who had settled into their long-haul flight. Somewhere over the Midwest, at 37,000 feet, the aircraft hummed with the steady rhythm of engines slicing through the night. The flight attendants moved gracefully up and down the aisles, collecting trays, offering refills, whispering politely to drowsy travelers. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary, until it wasn't. Row 2, Seat A. Dr. Malcolm Hightower shifted uncomfortably in his leather seat. A thin line of sweat had begun to gather at his temples, though the cabin air was cool. He pressed a hand to his stomach, willing the sharp pang to fade. Just nerves, he told himself. Maybe it was fatigue. He had been awake since dawn, juggling hospital rounds before catching this late flight east. But when the pain deepened, sharp as a knife, he knew something was wrong. He pressed the call button. A chime echoed softly. Passengers barely stirred. The nearest attendant, Heather Lawson, appeared a moment later. Her smile was polite, but her eyes were flat. Yes. Sir Malcolm leaned forward, his voice low but urgent. Something's wrong. My stomach. I feel dizzy. Please water. Maybe a doctor on board Heather blinked, then tilted her head in an almost dismissive shrug. Sir, sometimes the food just doesn't sit right. Maybe take a deep breath. I'll check if I have some ginger ale. She didn't move. Malcolm's chest tightened. He tried to steady his breathing. The other passenger beside him, a broad-shouldered man in a tailored suit, shifted with irritation. Gregory Stanton had barely concealed his disdain since takeoff. He smirked now, shaking his head. Some people can't handle first class, he muttered, not even trying to lower his voice. The words cut sharper than the cramps twisting inside him. Malcolm closed his eyes. For years he had learned to swallow these barbs, to rise above them. But tonight his body wasn't cooperating. The pain escalated. A bead of sweat trickled down his cheek. His hands trembled as he fumbled for the armrest. The cabin blurred. He felt the floor tilt, though the plane remained steady. He pressed the call button again, more frantic this time. The chime rang louder in his head. A desperate alarm. Heather returned, irritation flickering across her face. Sir, I just spoke with the galley. We're in descent prep soon. Please, sit back and relax. Malcolm's vision spotted with black. Please, he whispered. I need help. Something's wrong. His voice cracked, breaking through the calm he always carried like armor. Passengers across the aisle began to notice. A woman leaned forward, concern etched across her face. "Excuse me. He doesn't look okay," she called out. Heather's smile grew tight, forced. "Ma'am, I have it under control." But she didn't move closer. She didn't reach for oxygen. She didn't call the cockpit. Malcolm gripped the tray table, breath shallow, chest rising in uneven bursts. He thought of his daughter, her wide grin when she showed him the dance routine she had practiced just before he left for this trip. He thought of his sister Angela, who always reminded him to keep calm, to keep dignity, even when the world tried to strip it from him. He thought of the countless patients whose lives he had held in his steady hands, and now he couldn't even hold on to his own. A sharp cough rattled his chest. He bent forward. Then the world lurched. His body gave out. He collapsed sideways, half into the aisle, gasping for air. A wet sound filled the silence, followed by a streak of red staining his once crisp white shirt. Blood. The cabin erupted. Passengers shouted. Some leapt to their feet. "Get help! He's not breathing," one cried. Phones rose into the air, recording the chaos. Someone screamed for a doctor. Heather froze. For one chilling moment. She just stood there, lips pressed in a hard line, as if deciding whether this was inconvenience or emergency. Then another figure surged into the aisle. A young woman, Chloe Ramirez, a law student seated 2 rows back, dropped her phone into her lap after pressing record. She knelt beside Malcolm, her voice urgent. "Sir, stay with me. Somebody get the medical kit." Now her voice cracked the paralysis. Passengers scrambled. One reached overhead for the oxygen mask storage. Another ran down the aisle, yelling for help. Heather finally picked up the intercom. Her voice, cool but trembling slightly, echoed through the cabin. "If there is a doctor on board, please identify yourself." But the delay was costly. Malcolm's breathing was shallow, his eyes rolling back. His consciousness slipped like sand through trembling hands. The engines droned on outside. Indifferent, the cabin became a storm of voices, fear and urgency. Amid the chaos, one truth crystallized in every witness's mind. This should never have happened. Not like this. Not so preventable. The camera lens of Chloe's phone caught everything: Malcolm's collapse, Heather's hesitation, the pleas ignored. Within hours, that video would ricochet across social media, igniting outrage that no airline press release could contain. But in this moment, all that mattered was whether Malcolm Hightower would survive long enough to see justice served. Before the chaos at 37,000 feet, before the gasps and the shouts and the streak of blood across a white shirt, there was a man. His name was Dr. Malcolm Hightower, and if you had asked anyone who knew him, they would have described him as the kind of man who carried the weight of the world with grace. Malcolm was 42 years old, a neurosurgeon who had spent nearly 2 decades inside operating rooms where the line between life and death could be as thin as a breath. Colleagues admired his steady hands, his calm voice, the way he could make a terrified patient believe that everything would be all right. He had built a reputation that stretched far beyond the hospital walls. Patients requested him by name. Hospitals tried to recruit him with generous offers. Yet Malcolm never chased prestige. What mattered most to him was the oath he had taken to heal, to do no harm, to give others the chance to keep dreaming. But behind that calm exterior was a man who carried memories like heavy stones. He had grown up on the east side of Detroit, in a neighborhood where sirens were more common than lullabies. His mother, Lorraine, raised him and his younger sister Angela with a kind of steel that only hardship can forge. Lorraine worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3, her hands rough from cleaning offices by day and nursing homes by night. Malcolm often remembered the nights when she came home after midnight. He would hear her drop her keys on the counter, sigh so deeply it sounded like the air itself was heavy, and then tiptoe into the bedroom to kiss her children's foreheads. She was exhausted, but she never let it show when she woke them for school the next morning. She insisted that Malcolm and Angela believe in something larger than survival. Your mind is your weapon, she would tell Malcolm. Learn how to use it, and no one can take it away from you. He took those words like scripture. By the time he was 16, Malcolm was spending more time in the library than on the basketball courts where his friends gathered. He loved anatomy books, loved the clean diagrams of the brain, the heart, the lungs. To him, they looked like maps of the human spirit. He dreamed of becoming a doctor, not for money, but for the power to fix what felt broken around him. Angela, 2 years younger, teased him for being the professor of the family, but she admired him. They studied together, and when Malcolm earned a full scholarship to college, Angela followed his footsteps into law. They were each other's anchors, a brother and sister bonded by fire. Now, years later, Malcolm had achieved everything his mother prayed for. A respected surgeon, a mentor to younger black medical students who saw in him a possibility they rarely encountered in textbooks. A father to a little girl who lit up his entire world. Her name was Maya, 8 years old, fierce and curious, with a laugh that sounded like sunshine breaking through clouds. Maya lived with her mother in Atlanta, but Malcolm made sure to be present for every milestone, every recital, every bedtime story he could manage between shifts. He had promised himself that Maya would never grow up doubting that her father loved her. The night before the flight, Malcolm sat in his apartment in Chicago packing a small suitcase, a crisp navy suit, a tie Maya had chosen for him last Father's Day, a loud blue pattern she insisted would bring him luck. He had a meeting scheduled in New York with a medical research foundation interested in funding his latest project, a program to provide free neurological care for underserved communities. It wasn't just work. It was his mission. As he folded shirts, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. Maya's face lit up the screen. He answered with a smile, already softening. "Daddy, guess what?" she squealed. I learned the whole routine for the school recital. She showed him the dance steps, twirling around her bedroom in pink pajamas. He clapped through the screen, his heart swelling. "You're incredible. Baby girl," he said. "When I'm back, you'll show me the full thing in person. I wouldn't miss it for the world." After the call ended, he sat in silence for a moment, suitcase half packed. The pride was real, but so was the weariness. He thought of all the times he had been questioned at airports, treated like an intruder in spaces he had earned the right to be in. The sideways glances at conferences, the raised eyebrows when he introduced himself as a neurosurgeon. He never let it deter him, but sometimes he wondered how many invisible battles a man could fight before they left scars. No scalpel could ever repair. As dawn broke, he drove to the airport, music low, mind focused on the meeting ahead. He told himself it was just another flight, just another trip. But the unease lingered. At the terminal, he rolled his suitcase into the first-class check-in line. He had paid for his seat in full, the ticket confirmation glowing on his phone, yet when he approached the gate, the attendant, Brenda Kowalski, scanned his boarding pass with a practiced smile that faded the moment her eyes landed on him. "First class?" she asked, as if she needed confirmation. "Yes," Malcolm replied evenly. Her lips pressed thin. "Sir, I'll need to verify this with my supervisor." Passengers behind him shifted impatiently. Malcolm felt the heat of their stares. He kept his voice calm. "It's a valid ticket. My seat is 2A. Brenda disappeared into a side office, leaving him standing there, the only passenger in line treated like a potential fraud. After several minutes, she returned, cheeks slightly flushed. "You can proceed," she said curtly, without apology. Malcolm adjusted his grip on the suitcase handle. He wanted to push back, to call out the insult for what it was. But then he remembered Maya's smile, Angela's counsel, his mother's words. Dignity was his shield. He walked forward without looking back. On board. The cabin smelled faintly of leather and coffee. He placed his bag overhead, sank into 2A, and exhaled. He told himself to focus on the meeting in New York, on the foundation, on the lives he could change. He didn't know yet that his own life was about to be thrust into the center of a storm, because somewhere in that same cabin, biases were waiting, sharp as blades hidden beneath polite smiles. And before the night was over, Malcolm would learn just how dangerous indifference could be. The boarding process always felt like a performance, and Malcolm Hightower knew the choreography by heart. Lines of passengers snaked through the jet bridge, rolling bags bumping against ankles, boarding passes clenched in impatient hands. Flight attendants at the doorway smiled on cue, scanning tickets with quick beeps. Everyone understood the rhythm. Malcolm adjusted the strap of his leather briefcase as he stepped onto the jet bridge. He could hear the muffled hum of engines through the walls. For him, air travel was routine, but there was always a thin thread of unease. Airports had never been neutral spaces. Too many times he had been stopped, questioned, treated like he did not belong. When he reached the front of the line, Brenda Kowalski was waiting with her tablet. Her blonde hair was pulled into a bun so tight it looked painful. She greeted the man ahead of him with a wide smile, almost singing the words. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Stanton. Enjoy your flight." Gregory Stanton nodded, adjusting his designer watch before walking down the jet bridge. His cologne lingered behind him. Brenda's expression shifted the moment her eyes landed on Malcolm. The smile flattened, the warmth drained. She scanned his boarding pass and paused. Her brows furrowed as though the screen displayed something suspicious. "First class?" she asked, her tone edged with disbelief. "Yes." Malcolm answered evenly. His voice carried no irritation, though inside he felt the familiar sting. She tapped her screen again, slowly. Too slowly. Passengers behind him shuffled, sighing. Brenda looked up, her lips pressed tight. "One moment. Sir, I just need to confirm something." Malcolm inhaled through his nose, steadying himself. He knew this routine. The implication was clear. He did not look like the kind of man who belonged in seat 2A. He glanced sideways at the impatient line of travelers. Some stared at the floor, pretending not to notice. Others glanced at him with curiosity, as if wondering what rule he had broken. After a long pause, Brenda finally nodded. "You may proceed," she said curtly. "No apology, no explanation." Malcolm walked forward, each step deliberate. He kept his head high, but inside, he felt the old ache. He thought of his mother's words, the lessons about carrying himself with dignity, no matter how others tried to strip it away. He reminded himself that he was here on business, representing more than just himself. Still, the humiliation clung to him like static. At the cabin door, Heather Lawson greeted him. She wore the same uniform as the other attendants, but her posture radiated authority. She had been working first class for years, and she made sure everyone knew it. "Good evening, Mr.?" She glanced at his boarding pass again. her eyes flicking up and down with a trace of skepticism. "Hightower." "Good evening," Malcolm replied softly. Heather's smile was polite, but hollow. She stepped aside without the warmth she had shown to Greg Stanton only moments earlier. Malcolm noticed. He noticed everything. He slid into seat 2O. The leather was smooth, the armrests wide, the small comforts of first class. Yet comfort was not the same as acceptance. As he placed his briefcase under the seat, Greg Stanton dropped into 2B with a heavy thud. "Quite the crowd tonight," Greg said loudly, as if Malcolm were obligated to respond. His voice was brash, practiced in boardrooms where volume passed for authority. Malcolm offered a polite nod. Choosing silence, Greg smirked. "So, what do you do? Must be something big if you're sitting up here." Malcolm glanced at him, meeting his eyes. "I'm a neurosurgeon." For a moment, Greg looked surprised, then amused. He chuckled, shaking his head. "Well, that's something. You don't see that every day." The implication hung in the air. Malcolm's jaw tightened, but he let it pass. He turned toward the window, watching the lights on the tarmac shimmer against the dark sky. Passengers continued boarding. Heather bustled up and down the aisle, offering drinks, helping with bags. Her tone shifted like a dial depending on whom she addressed. With Greg, she was bright, warm, almost flirtatious. With Malcolm, she was clipped, efficient, as if fulfilling a duty rather than offering service. When she brought the pre-flight drinks, she handed Greg a glass of champagne with a flourish. "For you, Mr. Stanton. Vintage." Then she turned to Malcolm with a plastic cup of water. "And for you, sir." Malcolm accepted it quietly. He did not ask why he had not been offered champagne. He already knew the answer. As the cabin filled, a young woman appeared in row 3. She wore jeans and a college sweatshirt, her dark hair pulled into a bun. She looked younger than most in this section, and she carried herself with a mix of nerves and determination. Malcolm would later learn her name was Chloe Ramirez, a law student traveling for a moot court competition. At that moment, she simply nodded politely to him as she stowed her bag. Greg leaned closer to Malcolm, lowering his voice. "They're letting anyone up here these days." "Huh." He nodded toward Chloe with a smirk. Malcolm turned to him, eyes calm but steady. "Everyone here paid for their seat." "Same as you." Greg raised his eyebrows, taken aback by the firmness in Malcolm's tone. He leaned back, muttering something under his breath. Malcolm settled into his seat, forcing his body to relax. He had trained himself over years to choose composure over confrontation. But his thoughts churned beneath the surface. How many times would he have to prove he belonged? How many times would he be reduced to suspicion or novelty? The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing departure. Flight attendants secured the cabin, walking briskly down the aisle. Heather passed Malcolm without a glance, her smile reserved for others. As the plane began to taxi, Malcolm closed his eyes for a moment. He thought of Maya again, of the dance recital he had promised to attend. He thought of Angela, who would remind him not to shrink in the face of prejudice. He thought of the patients waiting for him, people whose lives depended on his skill, his steadiness. The engines roared, the plane lifted, and the ground fell away. Malcolm opened his eyes to the clouds outside his window. He told himself that once they landed, none of this would matter. It was just another flight, another set of small indignities he could tuck away. But deep down he felt the tension building, like pressure in a sealed cabin. He did not know that this journey would test more than his patience. It would test his life, his faith in justice, and the very systems meant to protect passengers in the air. And as the seatbelt sign dimmed, the stage was set for everything that was about to unravel. The plane leveled out at cruising altitude. The seatbelt sign chimed off, and the quiet hum of the cabin settled into routine. Passengers reclined, loosened ties, unfolded newspapers, or flicked through glossy in-flight magazines. The steady drone of the engines felt almost soothing, like white noise against the undercurrent of tension. In seat 2A, Malcolm adjusted his posture, sliding the small pillow behind his lower back. He pressed his fingers together in a habit formed from years of surgeries, as if grounding himself in a ritual of calm. To an observer, he looked perfectly composed, but inside his mind replayed every subtle slight from boarding until now. Brenda's skeptical pause at the gate, Heather's clipped tone, Greg's mocking smirk. They were small cuts, but layered one after another, they left him raw. Greg Stanton shifted in 2B, making himself comfortable with the entitlement of someone who never doubted his place. He loosened his collar, stretched his arms wide, elbows spilling into Malcolm's space without hesitation. "Tight quarters, huh," he said, though his tone carried no apology. Malcolm angled himself slightly toward the window, choosing silence. He had learned long ago that not every comment deserved a reply. But Greg wasn't finished. "So, Doc," he said, leaning closer, "you do brains, right? Cutting people open and all that?" "Yes," Malcolm answered simply. Greg chuckled. "Must be nice. Big paycheck, big respect. I bet you never have to worry about anything." Malcolm turned his head slowly, meeting Greg's eyes. "Everyone worries about something." Greg smirked, sipping his champagne. "Well, not me. I've built companies, sold them, made millions. Stress is for people who don't know how to win." Malcolm said nothing. He had no interest in measuring worth by dollars. Yet he felt the familiar push, the attempt to assert superiority, to remind him of his supposed place. He inhaled deeply, steady and quiet. Heather approached with her service cart, her smile warming immediately when she saw Greg. "Another glass of champagne for you, Mr. Stanton." "Absolutely," Greg said, handing over his empty flute. She poured generously, the bubbles rising in delicate streams. Then she turned to Malcolm, her expression flattening. "Water." Sir Malcolm glanced at the rows behind him, where other first-class passengers were being offered wine or cocktails. He looked back at Heather. "A glass of red wine, please." She paused, the briefest flicker of annoyance crossing her face. "Of course," she said at last, pouring reluctantly. She placed the glass in front of him without the flourish she had given Greg. Malcolm thanked her anyway, his tone calm. She moved on, and Greg snorted softly. "You must get that a lot," he said under his breath. Malcolm raised his eyebrows. "Get what?" Greg leaned closer. "That look, like you don't belong, like you got lucky with your ticket." Malcolm studied him carefully. "And what makes you think I don't belong?" Greg shrugged, smirking. "Just an observation." Malcolm turned back to the window, unwilling to let Greg's provocation burrow deeper. Yet inside, he felt the quiet churn of frustration. He had built a life on excellence, discipline, and resilience. Still, in spaces like this, strangers saw only their own projections. Dinner service began. The scent of roasted chicken and grilled salmon drifted through the cabin. Heather returned with plates, her voice bright once more for Greg. "Mr. Stanton? We have filet mignon tonight, cooked medium rare as requested." She placed the dish before him with practiced grace. Greg smiled broadly. Perfect. Thank you. Then Heather turned to Malcolm. And for you, sir, the fish entree. Malcolm frowned slightly. I had requested the beef when I booked my meal. Heather's smile was thin. We ran out. He glanced at Greg's perfectly cooked fillet, then at the other passengers receiving their choices. Something in the air shifted, the faint scent of spoiled fish rising as she set the plate down. The salmon looked pale, the edges dry. Malcolm hesitated, instincts bristling. Still, he forced a polite nod. Thank you. Heather moved on without another word. Greg speared a piece of steak, juices running across his plate. Now that's how you do first class, he said between bites. Malcolm stared at his plate. He lifted his fork, cutting into the salmon. A faint sourness rose, subtle but unmistakable. His stomach clenched with warning. For a moment he considered refusing it. But then he thought of the eyes around him, the unspoken narrative that he was difficult, demanding, ungrateful. He hated giving anyone that ammunition. So he took a bite. The texture was wrong. The taste lingered bitter on his tongue. He swallowed slowly, setting down his fork. Chloe Ramirez, the young law student in row 3, watched from her seat. She had been noticing details since boarding, her mind cataloging interactions the way aspiring lawyers often do. She saw Heather's dismissiveness, Greg's arrogance, Malcolm's composure. She saw the subtle shifts in tone and posture, the small tells that betrayed bias. And when she saw Malcolm hesitate over the fish, her stomach tightened with unease. Malcolm sipped his wine, hoping to wash away the taste. He closed his eyes briefly, steadying himself. His mind whispered questions. Was he imagining it? Was he reading too much into it? Was this just another harmless oversight, or something more insidious? The engines hummed on, the cabin filled with clinking cutlery and muted conversation. For everyone else, it was just another meal at 37,000 feet. For Malcolm, it felt like a test. Greg leaned back, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin. See, Doc, you just gotta know how to work the system. Life's about leverage. People like me, we always come out on top. Malcolm studied him for a moment, then spoke quietly. Not every victory is measured in profit. Greg scoffed, dismissing the words with a wave of his hand. Spoken like a man who doesn't understand the game. Malcolm did not answer. His stomach twisted, a faint cramp rippling through him. He pressed a hand against his abdomen, almost absently, as if willing it away. Chloe noticed. She leaned forward slightly, her brow furrowing. She made a mental note. Something was unfolding, and she knew instinctively it mattered. Malcolm lifted his wineglass again, but the taste of fish clung to his tongue. His body felt tense, uneasy. He stared at the glass for a long moment before setting it down. The meal service continued, Heather gliding gracefully between rows, her smile returning for others, her warmth selective. To the casual observer, everything seemed ordinary, but beneath the polished veneer of first class, friction simmered. Malcolm sat in silence, his thoughts layered. He thought of Maya and her recital. He thought of Angela and the countless times she told him to stand firm. He thought of his mother's resilience, the sacrifices that had carried him to this seat, and he thought of the taste of spoiled fish lingering on his tongue, an omen he could not shake. The cabin lights dimmed for evening service. Passengers settled, reclining with blankets and screens. Malcolm leaned his head against the seat, closing his eyes. He told himself it was nothing, that the tension would pass. But deep inside, a storm was beginning to gather. The hum of the engines was steady, almost hypnotic, and for most passengers the evening meal passed without notice. For Dr. Malcolm Hightower, however, every second began to stretch longer, heavier, as something in his body shifted. It started as a faint ache in his stomach, a twinge he tried to ignore. He had pulled all-nighters in the hospital, powered through exhaustion, operated on failing brains with focus sharper than steel. Compared to that, what was a little stomach ache at 37,000 feet? He straightened in his seat, took a sip of water, and told himself to breathe. But the ache deepened, twisting like a knot pulled tighter with every breath. He pressed a hand against his abdomen, willing it away. His forehead felt damp. He glanced down at the linen napkin folded across his lap and noticed small beads of sweat dripping onto the fabric. Greg Stanton, beside him, was still savoring his fillet. He noticed Malcolm shift uncomfortably and smirked. "Not sitting right with you? Doc should have gone with the steak." Malcolm didn't answer. He leaned back, closed his eyes for a moment, and tried to steady his breathing. He felt the strange sourness rising in his throat, the bitter aftertaste of the fish that clung no matter how much water he drank. Heather Lawson walked past, pausing at Greg's request for another glass of champagne. She poured with a practiced smile, her attention fixed on him. Malcolm raised a hand slightly. "Excuse me," he said, his voice quiet but urgent. "Could I have some water?" And maybe he hesitated, not wanting to sound dramatic. "Something feels off. Could you check if there's a doctor on board?" Heather's smile faltered, then returned, brittle around the edges. "Sir, it's probably just indigestion. The food can be heavy. I'll bring you some ginger ale." She turned quickly, not waiting for his reply. Malcolm felt his jaw tighten. He had treated hundreds of patients who minimized their symptoms until it was too late. Now here he was, doing the same thing to himself. Was it pride or fear of confirming every prejudice in the cabin that he was needy, difficult, overreacting? The ache became sharper. He shifted forward, elbows on his knees, head bowed. His breath came shorter, faster. Chloe Ramirez, sitting in the row behind, noticed. She had been watching quietly since the meal service, her law student's mind cataloging details like evidence. She saw Malcolm's hand pressed against his stomach, the sheen of sweat on his forehead, the tension in his shoulders. She also saw Heather glance at him with indifference, then return to her pleasant chatter with Greg. Chloe leaned forward, her voice low. "Sir, are you all right?" Malcolm turned his head slightly, eyes tight with pain. He forced a small nod. "Just a stomach issue. Thank you." But Chloe was not convinced. She had studied enough cases, read enough testimonies, to recognize dismissal when she saw it. She kept her phone in her lap, recording quietly. Something told her this moment mattered. The cramps surged again, doubling Malcolm over. He pressed the call button. The chime echoed. Heather arrived, irritation flickering across her features. "Sir," she said firmly, "I already told you. We're in descent prep in a short while. Just sit back and try to relax." Malcolm's voice cracked, his composure breaking. "I need help. Please." Passengers nearby began to notice. A woman across the aisle frowned. "He doesn't look okay," she said aloud. Heather's lips tightened. "Ma'am, I have the situation under control." But she didn't move closer. Malcolm's vision blurred, spots of black clouding his sight. He tried to think of his daughter, Maya, her voice the night before, her tiny feet tapping in a dance routine she was so proud of. He tried to hold on to that memory as the cramps ripped through him. He felt heat crawl up his chest, then a wave of nausea. He coughed sharply, a metallic taste flooding his mouth. He grabbed the napkin from his lap and pressed it against his lips. When he pulled it away, the white linen was streaked with red. The cabin froze. Gas echoed. Passengers craned their necks. Greg muttered something under his breath, eyes wide but unsympathetic. Chloe shot to her feet. "He's bleeding," she shouted. "Somebody help him." Phones rose instantly, cameras flashing red dots as recordings began. The sound of seatbelts unclicking filled the cabin. A man from row 4 stood. "I'm a nurse," he said. He rushed toward Malcolm, kneeling beside him. Heather hesitated, her hands gripping the service cart. For a moment it seemed she might argue, might insist the situation was under control. Then she grabbed the intercom. Her voice, cool but unsteady, rang out. "If there is a doctor on board, please make yourself known." The nurse pressed 2 fingers to Malcolm's pulse. "It's weak," he said. "We need oxygen now." Chloe leaned closer, her phone still recording. "Stay with us, sir," she urged. "You're going to be okay." Malcolm's breathing was ragged, shallow. Each inhale a battle. He felt the weight of the moment pressing down. He thought of his patients on operating tables, how he had guided them back from the edge. Now he was the one at the edge, and the faces above him blurred into shadows. Heather reappeared with an oxygen mask, fumbling with the straps. The nurse slipped it over Malcolm's face, urging him to breathe. Passengers whispered. Some prayed softly, others glared at Heather, their suspicion growing. The engines roared on outside, indifferent. The plane cut through the night sky, carrying with it a storm that no one could yet name. Malcolm clung to consciousness, but darkness crept closer. In his mind he saw Maya's face, smiling, reaching out. He whispered her name, barely audible through the mask. The nurse looked up sharply. "We need to get this plane on the ground." Heather picked up the intercom again, her voice trembling this time. "Captain, we have a medical emergency in first class." The cabin was chaos now. The orderly performance of first-class service had unraveled completely. Passengers recorded, muttered, demanded action. Chloe kept her phone steady, her own breath shaking, but her resolve firm. She knew this was not just a medical crisis. It was something larger, something tied to the coldness she had witnessed earlier. The dismissal that nearly cost a man his life, and though no one yet realized it, the video in her hands would soon ignite a firestorm far beyond this cabin. For Malcolm, there was only the fight to hold on, to breathe, to survive long enough to see if the world would notice that his life mattered at 37,000 feet. The cabin of an airplane is designed for routine. Flight attendants glide, passengers recline. The hum of engines sets a rhythm of calm. But when something goes wrong, that rhythm shatters into noise. That night in first class, every sound seemed louder. The clink of glasses, the murmur of voices, the sharp beep of a call button pressed again and again. Dr. Malcolm Hightower felt the world slipping beneath him. The cramps in his stomach had become unbearable, a twisting, stabbing pain that radiated up into his chest. His breathing was shallow, each inhale more difficult than the last. The oxygen mask strapped to his face offered little relief, the flow weak against the weight pressing down on his lungs. The nurse who had rushed from row 4 was speaking urgently. "We need fluids. We need vitals. He is crashing." His hands moved quickly, trying to stabilize Malcolm with nothing but the limited tools available in a cabin. Heather Lawson stood stiffly near the galley, her arms crossed, Her eyes flicked nervously from the passengers to the intercom. It was as though she were caught between protocol and disbelief, unwilling to accept that the man in 2A could truly be dying in front of her. Greg Stanton shifted uncomfortably in 2B. His smirk had disappeared, replaced by unease. He leaned away as if Malcolm's suffering were contagious. "This is getting out of hand," he muttered. "They should have better screening for people who aren't fit to fly." Chloe Ramirez, still holding her phone, whipped around at him. He was fine until he ate that meal. "You saw it." Her voice shook with anger. "Do not blame him for this." Greg scoffed but said nothing more. Malcolm tried to focus. His thoughts swirled like loose papers caught in a storm. He remembered scrubbing in for surgeries, the fluorescent lights, the cold instruments laid out in order. He remembered guiding a patient's life back from the brink, steady hands refusing to tremble. Now his own body betrayed him, and he hated the helplessness clawing at his pride. The nurse pressed the oxygen mask tighter to Malcolm's face. "Stay with me," he urged. "You are going to make it." Malcolm wanted to believe him, but the darkness edging his vision felt heavy, unstoppable. Around the cabin, passengers rose from their seats. A woman began praying softly in Spanish. A man argued loudly with Heather. "Why didn't you call for help sooner? He could have died already." Heather's face flushed. "We followed procedure," she snapped, though her voice cracked. "The captain has been informed. We are preparing for emergency landing." Chloe's phone caught everything. Heather's tone, the passenger's anger, Malcolm's limp body against the seat. She knew the footage would matter, that it would speak louder than words when the world demanded answers. Still, in this moment, all she wanted was for him to live. Malcolm's mind drifted to his daughter, Maya. He could see her spinning in her pink pajamas, hair flying, laughter bright as music. He whispered her name through the mask, the sound muffled but desperate. Chloe leaned in closer. "Who is Maya?" she asked softly, as if anchoring him to the present. "My daughter," he breathed, the words barely formed. Chloe squeezed his hand. "Then hold on for her. Do not let go." The captain's voice broke through the intercom, calm, authoritative, practiced. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a medical emergency on board. We are diverting to Denver International Airport. Please remain seated as we prepare for descent." The announcement rippled through the cabin. Fear, confusion, tension. Passengers clutched armrests, eyes darting to Malcolm, then to the attendants who now scrambled with equipment they should have used earlier. Heather finally crouched beside the nurse, offering the small medical kit that had been stowed away. The nurse rifled through it, frustration etched on his face. No IV fluids, barely any supplies. "This is unacceptable." Malcolm's body jerked with another wave of pain. He coughed violently, more blood staining the oxygen mask. Gasps echoed around him. Chloe steadied the phone, her voice breaking as she spoke into the camera. They ignored him. He begged for help, and they ignored him. The engines changed pitch as the plane began its descent. The cabin tilted slightly, overhead bins rattling. Malcolm felt the shift in gravity, the weight pressing him deeper into the seat. He struggled to stay awake, his eyelids heavy. He thought of Angela, his sister. He remembered the night before he left, her voice on the phone. "Stay strong, Malcolm, and remember, you do not always have to carry everything alone." He wanted to tell her she had been right, that strength was not always enough. The nurse checked his pulse again. "It is weak, but he is still with us," he announced loudly, perhaps to reassure the others as much as himself. Passengers began murmuring, some offering prayers, others cursing the airline. A man in business attire shook his head. Unbelievable. In first class, no less. If this is how they treat him, what hope is there for the rest of us? Heather looked pale now, her earlier confidence stripped away. She clung to the service cart for balance as the descent grew steeper. Malcolm's body sagged. He drifted in and out of consciousness. Each time his eyes fluttered open, he saw fragments of faces leaning over him. Chloe's determined eyes, the nurse's firm jaw, Heather's strained expression, then darkness again. The plane trembled as it hit turbulence. Gas filled the air, overhead bins rattling louder. Malcolm felt himself sliding, weightless for a moment, before the seatbelt pulled him back. His chest burned. He coughed again, weaker this time. Chloe leaned in, her voice urgent but soothing. "Stay awake. Dr. Hightower, you are almost there. Just a little longer." He wanted to answer her, to assure her he was fighting, but his lips barely moved. The descent seemed endless. The nurse kept pressure on Malcolm's chest, monitoring each shallow breath. Passengers whispered, some cried softly. The atmosphere was thick with fear, injustice, and disbelief that a man so accomplished, so dignified, could be brought so low simply because help had been denied when it mattered most. Finally, the landing gear thumped beneath the cabin. The flaps extended. The engines roared. The plane touched down hard on the Denver runway, tires screeching. Gasps of relief mingled with sobs. "Stay seated," Heather's voice called over the intercom. Though few listened, the urgency of the moment outweighed protocol. The plane taxied to a halt. Through the windows, flashing red and blue lights approached. Ambulances and emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft like sentinels. As the door opened, paramedics rushed aboard with stretchers and equipment. They moved quickly, efficiently, taking control from the stunned flight crew. The nurse stepped back, relief flashing in his eyes. Malcolm was lifted carefully, the oxygen mask still strapped to his face. His chest rose faintly, but his pulse remained fragile. Passengers craned their necks, some applauding weakly as if their encouragement might carry him through. Chloe followed close behind, her phone still recording, her eyes blazing with determination. She knew this was not just a story about one man's survival. It was about what had been allowed to happen in the first place. As Malcolm was carried down the aisle, the cabin fell silent. The weight of what had just unfolded pressed on every witness. They knew they had seen more than a medical emergency. They had seen indifference exposed, prejudice laid bare at 37,000 feet, and none of them would ever forget it. The cabin doors opened to a rush of cold night air. Emergency vehicles lined the tarmac, their flashing lights painting the fuselage in red and blue. Paramedics stormed inside with equipment slung across their shoulders, their voices urgent and commanding. "Where's the patient?" one asked, though his eyes had already locked onto the limp figure in 2A. Dr. Malcolm Hightower lay strapped to the seat, oxygen mask fogged with shallow breaths. His skin looked gray under the harsh cabin lighting. The nurse who had helped him stepped aside quickly, relief softening his features as professionals took over. "Male, early 40s, the nurse reported. Severe abdominal distress, vomiting blood, weak pulse, possible food poisoning, but worsening rapidly. Paramedics slid Malcolm onto a stretcher with practiced precision. His head lolled to the side, eyes half open. The oxygen mask stayed in place as they secured IV lines and checked vitals. Passengers leaned into the aisle, whispering prayers, capturing video, recording every moment. Some reached out, touching the stretcher gently as it passed. Others sat stunned, their expressions mirroring the same silent question. How had it gotten this far? Heather Lawson followed a few steps, her face pale. She avoided eye contact with passengers who glared at her openly now. For hours she had been in control of this cabin, but control had slipped from her hands. As the stretcher was wheeled down the narrow aisle, Chloe Ramirez stayed close behind. Her phone was still recording, though her other hand clutched the seatbacks for balance. Her voice cracked as she spoke quietly into the camera. This man begged for help. He begged, and they ignored him until it was almost too late. Malcolm's breathing hitched as paramedics maneuvered the stretcher out the cabin door. The night air rushed in stronger now, carrying the metallic scent of jet fuel and the sharper scent of fear. Outside, cameras flashed. News outlets had already been alerted to the emergency landing. Smartphones recorded from the windows of the terminal. The sight of a black man in a first-class suit, unconscious and pale, being carried from an aircraft was not an image anyone would forget quickly. Chloe kept filming as she stepped onto the jet bridge. Paramedics loaded Malcolm into an ambulance, lights strobing against the night. The doors slammed shut, and the siren wailed as the vehicle sped off toward Denver General Hospital. Passengers trickled into the terminal, some shaken, others angry. A woman in her 50s spoke to a reporter who had rushed to the gate. He was asking for help. We all heard him. They treated him like he was exaggerating, like he wasn't worth the effort. If it weren't for the nurse and that young woman, he could have died right there in his seat. Greg Stanton lingered nearby, his phone in hand, face tight with irritation. When pressed by another passenger, he muttered, "Look, people get sick on flights all the time. This is being blown out of proportion." His words only fueled the anger of those around him. Meanwhile, Chloe sat on a bench near the gate, uploading her video. Her hand shook as she typed the caption, "Passenger in first class begged for help," was ignored until he collapsed. This is what happened at 37,000 feet. She attached the hashtags instinctively. No to justice, fire, or 2A. No of Malcolm Hightower. War, flight 247. The video spread with a speed that startled even her. Within minutes, retweets flooded her notifications. Comments poured in disbelief, anger, sorrow. The clip showed Malcolm pressing the call button, Heather dismissing him, the blood staining his shirt, the panic in the cabin. It was undeniable, raw, impossible to explain away. By the time the ambulance reached the hospital, the video had been shared by civil rights activists, journalists, and celebrities. News alerts buzzed on phones across the country. Medical emergency on Atlantic Sky Airlines flight raises questions of bias. At the airline's headquarters, phones rang nonstop. Public relations teams scrambled to draft statements. Executives gathered in a conference room, eyes glued to the viral footage playing on screens. The CEO, Robert Thornton, leaned forward, jaw tight. What exactly happened on that plane? No one had an answer he wanted to hear. Back at the hospital, Malcolm was wheeled into the emergency department. Doctors and nurses swarmed, hooking up monitors, drawing blood, rushing him through scans. The diagnosis was severe food poisoning, compounded by internal bleeding from violent retching. He was stable for the moment, but the prognosis was uncertain. Angela Hightower received the call in Chicago just after midnight. Her phone vibrated on the nightstand, pulling her from restless sleep. She answered groggily, then froze as the voice on the line explained what had happened. Her brother collapsed. Emergency landing. Intensive care. She sat up, heart pounding. "I am on the next flight," she said firmly. Her voice trembled only after she hung up. In the terminal at Denver, passengers continued giving statements to local police and reporters. Many replayed the same story: a man asked for help, was dismissed, collapsed, nearly died. The anger grew as more details emerged. Chloe's video surpassed 1 million views before dawn. By morning, it was on every news outlet, from cable television to digital front pages. Headlines screamed, "Passenger in first class ignored by crew before collapse in airline faces." Outrage after viral video of medical emergency. Civil rights leaders issued statements demanding accountability. Lawyers tweeted offers of representation. Activists organized hashtags into a movement overnight. Justice 428 trended at #1 across the country. Heather Lawson's name had not yet been released publicly, but already speculation swirled. Photos from other passengers identified her face. Online detectives pieced together fragments of her career, her previous complaints, her record. The narrative was forming, and it was damning. Greg tried to distance himself from the unfolding firestorm, but snippets of him dismissing the incident, caught on camera by nearby passengers, began circulating as well. His careless words painted him as complicit in the cruelty. Through it all, the central image remained Malcolm Hightower, a respected black neurosurgeon, collapsed and gasping, while those entrusted with his safety stood by. In Denver General's ICU, monitors beeped steadily. Malcolm drifted in and out of consciousness. In one lucid moment, he whispered Maya's name, his daughter's face vivid in his mind. He wondered if she would ever know how close he had come to vanishing from her life in the span of a single flight. Back on social media, strangers posted messages of support, praying for Dr. Hightower. This cannot go unpunished. We see you, and we will not stay silent. By morning, the airline could no longer contain the storm. Robert Thornton prepared to face cameras, but no statement could erase what millions had already witnessed with their own eyes. The world had seen indifference at 37,000 feet. Now it demanded justice. By sunrise, the video of Dr. Malcolm Hightower's collapse had been played on every major news network in America. Clips looped endlessly, Malcolm pressing the call button, Heather Lawson brushing him off, the moment he coughed blood onto his white shirt. Commentators debated, panelists argued, anchors raised their eyebrows in disbelief. In living rooms across the country, people asked the same question. How could a man beg for help in first class, surrounded by professionals trained for emergencies, and be ignored until his life slipped through their fingers? At Atlantic Sky Airlines headquarters in Atlanta, the atmosphere was frantic. Executives crowded into the glass-walled boardroom, coffee cups scattered like chess pieces across the table. Screens at the front displayed live news coverage. The ticker at the bottom of the screen scrolled with a headline that made every stomach in the room tighten. Atlantic Sky faces scrutiny after viral flight video. CEO Robert Thornton leaned forward, his silver hair perfectly combed, his tailored suit immaculate. His voice, however, carried the tension of a man watching his empire shake. "We need a statement," he said. "Something that calms this down before it escalates." A vice president of communications cleared her throat. "We can say Dr. Hightower had a pre-existing medical condition. Emphasize that our crew followed protocol. If we make it sound like an unfortunate incident unrelated to service, we can limit liability." Robert tapped his pen against the table. "Fine. Draft it. Release it within the hour." The statement went live at 9 a.m. Eastern. Atlantic Sky Airlines confirms that Flight 247 diverted due to a passenger's medical emergency. Our crew followed established safety procedures. We extend our thoughts to the passenger and his family. The response was immediate and furious. Social media exploded. followed procedures. We all saw the video, one tweet read. Another post gathered hundreds of thousands of likes. They didn't follow procedures. They followed prejudice. Chloe Ramirez's video had already hit 10 million views by mid-morning. Activists amplified it with commentary, pointing out the racial undertones of Heather's dismissal. News anchors played side-by-side comparisons, Heather smiling warmly at Gregory Stanton, then showing her cold indifference toward Malcolm. The contrast was undeniable. At Denver General Hospital, Angela Hightower arrived, exhausted but fierce. She hurried through sterile hallways until she found the ICU. Behind the glass, her brother lay motionless, tubes and monitors keeping him tethered to life. She pressed her hand against the window, her reflection merging with his pale face. A doctor explained his condition, careful but honest, severe foodborne illness, complicated by dehydration and delayed intervention. He was stable but critical. Angela's jaw set. She had spent her career fighting injustice in courtrooms, but now it was personal. She turned to the reporters waiting outside the ICU and spoke with clear conviction. "My brother asked for help. He was ignored. This is not just a medical failure. This is racial bias with life or death consequences. And we will not be silent." Her words spread like wildfire. Clips of her statement were replayed across networks, clipped into viral tweets, quoted by activists. The story was no longer just about one man's collapse. It was about a system. By late afternoon, a storm gathered online. People began sharing their own stories of discrimination while flying. Hashtags multiplied. Justice for 2A was joined by flying while black. Former flight attendants tweeted about internal cultures of bias. Then came the leak. An anonymous email landed in the inboxes of several journalists. Attached was an internal Atlantic Sky document titled Passenger Value Index. The file detailed how passengers were ranked based on a secret algorithm that factored in spending history, loyalty status, and a controversial category perceived customer profile reliability. The examples given made stomachs drop. White business travelers ranked highest, black and brown passengers, especially those flying alone, consistently scored lower. The leaked document spread within hours. Headlines screamed, "Airline used hidden score to rank passengers." Analysts on TV dissected the data. Activists called it digital redlining in the skies. Robert Thornton watched the news from his office, rage simmering beneath his polished exterior. "Who leaked this?" he demanded. No one answered. His empire was unraveling faster than he could contain it. Meanwhile, in Denver, Chloe sat in the hospital cafeteria, exhausted but glued to her phone. She scrolled through messages from strangers thanking her for recording. Some called her brave. Others begged her to keep speaking out. She posted again, her words steady. "This is bigger than one man. This is about every time someone is dismissed because of the color of their skin. We all saw what happened. Now we demand change." Her post went viral instantly. Inside Malcolm's hospital room, machines beeped softly. He drifted between consciousness and sleep. In his clearer moments, he whispered to Angela about Maya. "Tell her I love her," he murmured. "Tell her I will fight to see her dance." Angela squeezed his hand. "You will tell her yourself. But right now the world needs to see what they did. And I promise you, Malcolm, they will answer for it." Back at headquarters, Robert Thornton tried damage control. He sat for a live interview, his polished smile straining. "Our airline values diversity and inclusion. This was a tragic incident, but our crew acted professionally." The interviewer interrupted him, holding up a printed copy of the leaked Passenger Value Index. Mr. Thornton, can you explain why this document shows racial bias embedded in your customer ranking system? Robert's face froze. The cameras caught every flicker of discomfort. His denial was weak, his words rehearsed. Viewers saw through him instantly. By evening, lawmakers were calling for investigations. The FAA announced an inquiry into Atlantic Sky's practices. Civil rights organizations prepared lawsuits. Angela began drafting legal strategies with colleagues who flooded her inbox offering help. The story dominated headlines for days. Protesters gathered outside Atlantic Sky offices, holding signs that read, "Justice at 30,000 feet and we fly. We deserve respect." Inside his hospital room, Malcolm stirred. His body was weak, but his spirit flickered alive when he saw Angela by his side and news clips playing softly on the TV. For the first time since the collapse, he realized the truth. His suffering had not been ignored. It had ignited something larger than himself. He whispered through dry lips, barely audible, "Make it matter." Angela leaned close, her eyes fierce. It already does. Angela Hightower was no stranger to confrontation. As a civil rights attorney, she had stood in courtrooms across the country, arguing against discrimination in workplaces, schools, and police departments. But this case was different. This was her brother. Every headline, every replay of the video, every cruel comment online cut deeper than any file she had ever carried into court. On the morning after the leak of Atlantic Sky's Passenger Value Index, Angela stood outside Denver General Hospital with cameras flashing around her. She wore a simple black suit, her curls pulled back tightly. Her voice was steady, but her hands clenched the podium as she spoke. "My brother, Dr. Malcolm Hightower, nearly lost his life because a flight attendant chose to ignore him. He was dismissed, minimized, and left to suffer until his body collapsed. That was not an accident. That was bias in action. And thanks to the brave passengers who documented the truth, the world has seen it with their own eyes." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "Today, we are filing suit against Atlantic Sky Airlines, demanding accountability
not just for my brother, but for every passenger who has been treated as less than human."
The crowd erupted in cheers and chants. Reporters shouted questions, microphones thrust forward. Angela stepped back, her resolve etched on her face. Inside the hospital, Malcolm watched the coverage on television. His body was still weak, his voice faint, but a small smile tugged at his lips. He had never been comfortable with the spotlight, yet he felt a quiet pride knowing his sister was carrying his fight when he could not. Federal investigators arrived in Denver that same week. Agents from the FAA and FBI met with passengers, reviewing statements and gathering evidence. They spoke to Chloe Ramirez, who handed over her raw video files. She sat in the sterile interview room, her phone buzzing nonstop with notifications, and described everything she had seen. He pressed the call button. He asked for water. He asked for help. She brushed him off. "I recorded because I knew no one would believe it if there wasn't proof." The agent nodded gravely. "You understand this footage is central to the case. It shows negligence, and it shows motive." Chloe swallowed hard. It shows something worse than negligence. It shows indifference. Other passengers testified too. The woman across the aisle described how Heather told her the situation was under control, even as Malcolm coughed blood. The nurse recounted his frustration with the limited medical kit and the delay in calling for assistance. Their accounts matched, painting a picture of systemic failure and personal prejudice. At Atlantic Sky headquarters, panic deepened. Executives urged Robert Thornton to settle quietly, to offer compensation before the case grew larger. But Robert resisted, convinced the company could weather the storm with strong lawyers and careful messaging. He underestimated the momentum building against him. Civil rights organizations filed amicus briefs in support of the Hightowers. Politicians held press conferences demanding reforms in airline practices. Talk shows debated the role of race in customer service. The public had chosen sides, and the airline was losing. Angela worked tirelessly, drafting legal documents late into the night. Her office filled with boxes of depositions, medical records, and printed screenshots of viral tweets. Her colleagues urged her to pace herself, but she felt no choice. She had promised Malcolm she would not stop. One evening, she sat beside her brother's hospital bed, papers spread across her lap. Malcolm stirred, opening his eyes. His voice was raspy but clear. "You are working too hard." Angela smiled faintly. "You taught me that we do not stop until the job is done." He reached weakly for her hand. "Just promise me you are doing this for more than me." She squeezed his fingers gently. "I am doing this because the next man who presses a call button might not have a sister with a law degree. I am doing this because Maya deserves a father who comes home. And I am doing this because no one should be ranked as less worthy of help because of their skin." Malcolm's eyes welled, and he nodded slowly. The case formally began 2 weeks later. The courthouse in Denver was surrounded by reporters, protesters, and supporters carrying signs. "Justice for Malcolm. We fly. We matter." Angela walked up the courthouse steps flanked by her legal team. Cameras flashed like lightning. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. The airline's attorneys sat stiffly at their table, stacks of binders in front of them. Across the aisle, Angela adjusted her notes, her heart steady but pounding with the weight of responsibility. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. The case was officially underway. Chloe testified first. She sat tall in the witness box, her voice clear though her hands trembled slightly. The video played on the large screen behind her. The courtroom watched as Malcolm pressed the call button. Heather brushed him off, and chaos erupted. Gas filled the air. Even the jury shifted uncomfortably, some exchanging glances that spoke volumes. The airline's lawyers tried to undermine her credibility, suggesting she was biased, that she wanted attention. Chloe's eyes flashed. "I did not record for likes. I recorded because I saw a man being ignored when he needed help. If I had put my phone down, maybe none of us would be sitting here. But you cannot deny what is on that screen." Next came the nurse. His testimony was clinical, professional, devastating. He described Malcolm's vital signs: the lack of proper medical equipment, the wasted time. "Every minute matters," he said firmly. "The delay could have killed him." Angela rose to cross-examine Heather Lawson herself. Heather sat at the witness stand, her uniform replaced by a dark suit, her posture rigid. Angela's voice was calm but sharp. "Ms. Lawson, do you recall Dr. Hightower pressing the call button?" Heather hesitated. "Yes." "Do you recall him asking for water? Asking for a doctor?" "Yes." "And did you provide him with water?" Heather's lips tightened. "Not immediately." "Why not?" Angela pressed. Heather shifted uncomfortably. He did not appear critical at that moment. "I believed he was exaggerating." The courtroom murmured. Angela leaned forward. "Exaggerating? A man who nearly died before your eyes, who coughed blood onto his shirt. You believed he was exaggerating?" Heather's face reddened. That was before he collapsed. Angela's voice sharpened. And if he had died before he collapsed, would you still call it exaggeration? Heather faltered. Silence filled the room. Angela turned to the jury. Bias does not always scream. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it looks like hesitation. Sometimes it looks like indifference. But when a man is denied help because someone decided he was less believable, less worthy, that bias becomes deadly. The jurors' faces were solemn. The impact was clear. As proceedings stretched into days, the airline's defenses crumbled further. The leaked passenger value index was admitted into evidence. Experts testified about its discriminatory impact. Former employees came forward with stories of subtle instructions to prioritize certain profiles. By the end of the first week, it was no longer a question of whether the airline would be held accountable. The question was how severe the judgment would be. Outside the courthouse, crowds grew larger each day. Families shared their own stories into microphones. Activists demanded federal legislation. The movement had grown beyond Malcolm's case. It had become a reckoning inside the ICU. Malcolm continued to recover slowly. He followed news updates from his bed, his hand often clasped in Angela's when she returned each night. He knew she carried the fight not just for him, but for something far greater. And though he remained weak, his eyes held the same determination that had carried him through years of surgeries and struggles. He whispered once more to his sister, voice faint but fierce, "Win this, not just for me, for everyone." Angela nodded, her voice steady. "I will." The Denver courthouse buzzed with tension, like a pressure cooker ready to blow. For days, the trial of Atlantic Sky Airlines had gripped the nation. Crowds lined the sidewalks, holding signs and chanting for justice. Inside, reporters filled every available seat, notebooks open, cameras poised, eyes fixed on the drama unfolding at the front of the room. Angela Hightower adjusted her blazer as she prepared for another day of testimony. Her brother Malcolm was still recovering in the hospital, but his presence hovered in the room like a guiding force. She could almost hear his voice reminding her to stay calm, steady, precise. The case was no longer just about him. It was about every passenger who had ever been treated as less worthy of care. When the bailiff called the court to order, Heather Lawson was sworn in for another round of questioning. She walked stiffly to the witness stand, her posture rigid, her eyes darting toward the jury with fleeting desperation. Her earlier testimony had already raised doubts. Today would be worse. Angela rose slowly, every movement deliberate. She stepped toward the witness stand, her voice calm but edged with steel. "Ms. Lawson, yesterday you admitted that Dr." Hightower pressed the call button multiple times. "Correct." Heather nodded reluctantly. "Yes, and you admitted he asked for water and for a doctor." "Correct, yes." Angela's gaze sharpened. "And yet you did not provide him with water, nor did you call for medical assistance until he collapsed." Why? Heather hesitated, her lips tightening. He did not appear to be in immediate danger. In my judgment, he was exaggerating his discomfort. Angela let the silence linger, letting the jury absorb the words. Then she stepped closer. "Tell me, Miss Lawson, when a man is sweating, clutching his stomach, gasping for air, pressing the call button again and again, what part of that looks like exaggeration?" Heather's voice rose defensively. "We see passengers all the time who overreact. Upset stomachs, anxiety attacks, air sickness. I followed my experience." Angela's tone cut sharper. "Your experience, Miss Lawson, or your assumptions? Did you dismiss Dr. Hightower because he was black? Because you assumed his pain was not serious? because you believed his word carried less weight than others. The courtroom stirred with murmurs. The judge banged the gavel once for order. Heather's face flushed red. "No, I did not," Angela pressed harder. "You smiled at Mr. Stanton. You poured him champagne with a flourish. You gave him your full attention. Meanwhile, Dr. Hightower, a paying passenger in first class, was handed spoiled fish and indifference. Do you deny treating them differently?" Heather's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. I was simply following service protocol." Angela turned toward the jury, her voice rising with passion. "Protocol does not explain selective kindness. Protocol does not excuse indifference when a man is pleading for help. Bias is not always loud. Sometimes it hides in hesitation, in disbelief, in the choice to look away until it is too late." The jurors' eyes were fixed on Heather now, their expressions grim. The damage was done. Next came Robert Thornton, the CEO of Atlantic Sky Airlines. He entered the courtroom flanked by lawyers, his polished appearance unshaken, but his eyes betraying the fatigue of a man under siege. He raised his hand, swore the oath, and sat stiffly in the witness chair. Angela approached with quiet authority. "Mr. Thornton, as CEO, do you approve the policies that govern how passengers are treated?" "Yes," he said firmly. "And are you familiar with the Passenger Value Index?" "The document leaked from your company's internal systems." Robert's jaw tightened. "I have been made aware of it." Angela raised a printed copy, bold letters highlighted. "This document ranks passengers not only by spending history, but by so-called customer reliability profiles. It consistently ranks black and brown passengers lower. Can you explain that to this court?" Robert shifted, his voice carefully rehearsed. "The system was never intended to discriminate. It was a business tool to prioritize frequent flyers and loyal customers." Angela's eyes narrowed. "Then why do we see patterns where race correlates directly with lower scores? Why do passengers like Dr. Hightower, a man who has flown dozens of times for his work as a neurosurgeon, receive skepticism instead of service?" Robert cleared his throat. "I cannot speak to individual cases." Angela stepped closer, her voice resonant. "You cannot, or you will not." The tension in the room spiked. The jury leaned forward. Reporters scribbled furiously. Robert tried to maintain composure, but his silence spoke volumes. Angela turned to the judge. "Your Honor, this document is not just evidence of negligence. It is evidence of systemic discrimination embedded in company policy. It is a blueprint for unequal treatment at 37,000 feet. The judge allowed the exhibit." Gas rippled through the courtroom as copies of the Passenger Value Index were passed to the jury. The weight of the words settled like a stone. Over the next hours, former employees testified. One recalled being told to focus service on premium profiles when time was tight. Another described supervisors discouraging them from wasting resources on passengers deemed unreliable. Each story painted the same picture bias disguised as efficiency. By late afternoon, the tension had reached a boiling point. Angela delivered her closing cross-examination with a voice that trembled not from nerves but from conviction. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, my brother nearly died, not because there was no help available, but because help was withheld. He pressed the button. He asked politely. He begged. And still he was ignored until his body collapsed in a pool of blood. That is not protocol. That is prejudice. And prejudice in the air is as deadly as prejudice on the ground." Her words rang through the chamber. Jurors sat motionless, but their faces were etched with anger, with empathy, with recognition. Reporters outside would later say you could feel the tide turning in that moment. As the gavel struck to adjourn for the day, Angela returned to her seat, exhausted but unbroken. She glanced at her phone, which buzzed with a text from Malcolm's nurse at the hospital. "He is stable tonight." He asked how the case was going. Angela smiled faintly, whispering to herself, "It is going in the right direction. Malcolm, for you and for all of us." The Denver courthouse was packed on the morning the jury delivered its verdict. People lined the sidewalks holding signs. Reporters broadcasted live from the steps, and helicopters circled above, capturing the scene from the air. The trial had become more than a legal battle. It was a national reckoning. Inside, the air was heavy with anticipation. Angela Hightower sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded tightly, her heart pounding beneath her calm exterior. Across from her, Robert Thornton sat with his legal team, his face drawn and pale. Heather Lawson avoided eye contact, staring down at the polished wood of the defense table. The jury filed back into the courtroom, 12 men and women who had carried the weight of this decision for weeks. Their faces were solemn, but their eyes held clarity. The bailiff passed the envelope to the judge, who read silently before handing it back to the foreman. The foreman rose. His voice was steady. In the case of Hightower versus Atlantic Sky Airlines, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty of negligence and discrimination resulting in life-threatening harm. We award damages to the plaintiff in the amount of $200 million in compensatory damages and $800 million in punitive damages. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, sobs, cheers. Reporters scrambled for their microphones, broadcasting history in real time. Angela closed her eyes, exhaling a breath she had been holding for months. Tears welled as she reached for the hand of her co-counsel. Heather Lawson sank back into her chair, her face ashen. Robert Thornton clenched his jaw, his empire collapsing with the sound of the verdict. The judge's gavel struck sharply. "Order in the court." The noise quieted, but the energy still buzzed like electricity. Angela rose slowly. She turned to face the cameras, her voice carrying the weight of victory and the gravity of what it meant. Today, the jury affirmed what millions of people already knew. My brother's life matters. Our lives matter. No passenger should ever be treated as less than human. Justice has spoken, and change must follow. Her words were replayed on every news broadcast that night. Commentators declared it a landmark case, the largest settlement ever awarded against a commercial airline. Civil rights leaders called it a turning point in the fight for equity in air travel. Within days, Robert Thornton resigned as CEO under immense pressure from shareholders and the public. His replacement, a woman named Carol Whitman, promised sweeping reforms. She appeared on national television, her tone humble. Atlantic Sky Airlines failed, Dr. Hightower, and failed our passengers. We will implement comprehensive reforms, from mandatory anti-bias training to transparent passenger service policies. We are committed to rebuilding trust. But the changes went far beyond one airline. The FAA announced new federal regulations requiring airlines to standardize medical training for crews, expand onboard medical supplies, and enforce strict anti-discrimination policies. Lawmakers in Washington introduced the Hightower Aviation Justice Act, a bipartisan bill aimed at ensuring equal treatment for all passengers. The bill passed with overwhelming support, its signing televised with Angela and Malcolm standing beside the president at Denver General Hospital. Malcolm watched the coverage from his bed, his daughter Maya perched beside him. Her small hand clasped his, her eyes wide as she saw her father's name appear in bold letters across the screen. "Daddy," she whispered, "they are talking about you everywhere." Malcolm smiled faintly, his voice soft. "They are not just talking about me, Maya. They are talking about what is right." Angela entered the room, exhausted but glowing with pride. She hugged her brother carefully, mindful of his healing body. "We did it," she whispered. "No," Malcolm corrected gently. "You did it. And all those people who refused to stay silent. This victory belongs to everyone." As the weeks passed, Malcolm grew stronger. His steps were slow at first, but determination fueled his recovery. When he finally walked out of the hospital, cameras lined the exit. Supporters clapped and cheered as he lifted Maya into his arms. He waved once, not for attention, but as a gesture of gratitude. Heather Lawson faced her own reckoning. Stripped of her position, she was barred from working in aviation. She appeared briefly in a local interview, insisting she had been scapegoated, but the public was unmoved. For many, her name had become synonymous with indifference in the face of suffering. Gregory Stanton, whose smug dismissals had been caught on camera, issued a public apology after his business contracts began to collapse under boycotts. Few believed his words were sincere. His reputation never recovered. Chloe Ramirez became an unexpected voice for justice. Her video had sparked the outrage that fueled the case, and now she was invited to speak at universities and advocacy groups. She often told audiences, "I pressed record because I knew if I didn't, no one would believe him. But we should not need video proof for a man's pain to matter." Her words resonated deeply, inspiring others to speak out against injustice when they saw it. For Angela, the work did not stop. She used part of the settlement to establish the Hightower Foundation, dedicated to addressing systemic discrimination in transportation and healthcare. She poured her heart into it, determined to turn one family's pain into a legacy of change. And for Malcolm, life regained a new rhythm. He returned to his practice months later, slower but wiser. Patients greeted him with awe, not just as a surgeon, but as a symbol of resilience. He carried himself as he always had, with quiet dignity, but now his presence carried the weight of a story the world had seen. One evening, he attended Maya's recital, sitting in the front row with Angela beside him. As Maya twirled across the stage in her pink costume, Malcolm's eyes filled with tears, not just because she was growing, not just because he was alive to see it, but because he knew his struggle had paved the way for her to live in a world just a little fairer than before. When the curtain closed and applause thundered, Maya ran into his arms. He held her tightly, his heart swelling with gratitude. In that moment, he understood that survival was not the end of his story. It was the beginning of something greater. Months had passed since the verdict, but the echoes of the case still resonated across the nation. Airports were no longer the same. Posters with new rights for passengers lined terminal walls. Flight attendants now received extensive training in cultural sensitivity and medical readiness. Airlines scrambled to prove they were not the next Atlantic Sky, rolling out reforms with press conferences and glossy brochures. The Hightower Aviation Justice Act had become law. News anchors called it one of the most significant reforms in aviation since the era of deregulation. The legislation required expanded medical kits on every flight, stronger oversight of crew training, and a clear, enforceable ban on discriminatory service practices. For the first time, airlines faced real penalties not just for safety violations, but for violations of dignity. Dr. Malcolm Hightower returned gradually to his life. His body carried scars from the ordeal, but his spirit seemed sharpened by survival. He resumed surgery slowly, his hands steady, his eyes more thoughtful than ever. Patients greeted him not just as a doctor, but as a symbol. Some thanked him for his courage. Others simply looked at him with quiet respect. Yet Malcolm never sought heroism. In quiet moments, he still replayed the night on the plane, the bitter taste of the fish, the ache in his stomach, the call button unanswered, the blood on his shirt. These memories returned like shadows, but he refused to let them define him. Instead, he let them remind him of why he fought to heal, why dignity mattered, why survival was not just for himself, but for others who might one day press the same call button. Angela poured herself into the foundation that bore their family name. The Hightower Foundation quickly became a national voice, challenging systemic inequities in transportation and healthcare. She spoke at universities, in courtrooms, on television panels. Her voice carried authority not just because she was a lawyer, but because she was a sister who had fought for her brother's life in front of the world. Chloe Ramirez graduated from law school with honors. She credited the trial as the moment that crystallized her purpose. Her video had sparked outrage, but it was her testimony that gave it weight. She joined the Hightower Foundation as a young attorney, determined to make her career about more than herself. I pressed record because I knew people would doubt what I saw. She often said at events, but now I work so that no one's pain needs proof to be believed. Heather Lawson faded from public view. She moved out of state, away from the spotlight that had once seemed to promise glamour, but had instead delivered infamy. Her name was remembered, but never fondly. Some saw her as the face of indifference, a warning of what happened when prejudice clouded duty. Gregory Stanton's businesses collapsed in slow motion. Contracts dissolved. Investors pulled out. His name became shorthand for arrogance in the face of suffering. He released apology after apology, but the public had already judged him. He retreated from the public eye, living in the shadow of his own careless words. As for Robert Thornton, the once powerful CEO, he disappeared into retirement, stripped of the empire he had built. He issued no public statements, no memoirs, no apologies. History had written its verdict, and it was harsher than any court could have delivered. But the story was not about their downfall. It was about resilience. One autumn evening, Malcolm and Angela visited their mother's grave in Detroit. The cemetery was quiet, leaves crunching beneath their feet. Maya skipped between the rows, her laughter carrying softly in the breeze. Angela placed flowers at the headstone, her hand brushing the engraved name. She would have been proud, Angela said softly. Malcolm nodded. She always told us to use our minds as weapons. I never thought it would mean this kind of battle. Angela looked at her brother, her eyes wet but shining. You fought with your life. I fought with the law. And together, we gave her words meaning. Maya ran back to them, wrapping her arms around Malcolm's waist. Daddy, she said, did you win? Malcolm knelt so his eyes were level with hers. I am alive. That is winning. But the real victory is that you will grow up in a world where people are learning to do better. Maya tilted her head. Will they always do better? Malcolm paused, searching for words that would not lie. Not always, but enough people now know what happens when they do not. And that will make many think twice. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the family stood together, a silhouette of survival and strength. Later that night, Malcolm sat on his porch, the city humming quietly beyond. He opened his journal, something he had started during recovery. He wrote not as a surgeon, not as a victim, but as a man reflecting on the thin line between life and loss. He wrote about the pain, yes, but more about the faces that saved him. The nurse who ran forward without hesitation. The young woman who pressed record when others looked away. His sister who carried his fight into a courtroom. His daughter whose name kept him tethered when darkness closed in. He closed the journal, whispering into the night, "Make it matter." And it had. The world would remember the case of the man in 2A, not just as a viral story, but as a turning point. The story had become a cautionary tale, a lesson taught in corporate training sessions, a case study in law schools, a rallying cry for activists. But to Malcolm, it was simpler. It was proof that dignity is not optional, respect is not negotiable, and justice, though often delayed, can arrive with the force of a gavel and the power of truth. He looked at the stars, steady and bright, above, somewhere, thousands of feet in the air. Another plane hummed through the sky. He wondered if a passenger was pressing a call button at that very moment, and if a flight attendant would respond not with suspicion, but with care. For the first time in months, Malcolm felt peace settle over him. His life had been spared, his voice had been heard, and his struggle had changed something larger than himself. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the night hold him. The journey was not over, but the fight had already rewritten the sky. In the end, Dr. Malcolm Hightower survived. But his story is not just about survival, it is about exposure. It exposed an airline that chose prejudice over compassion, a system that ranked dignity by color, and a moment when silence nearly cost a life. Yet it also revealed something stronger, the courage of bystanders who refused to look away, the power of a sister who turned pain into justice, and the resilience of a man who carried his struggle with grace. This story reminds us that discrimination does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers, in hesitation, in doubt, in the refusal to act until it is too late. And that whisper can be deadly. But it also shows us that when we speak out, when we demand accountability, change is possible. Laws can shift, policies can reform, and lives can be protected. May we carry this story as both a warning and a promise that dignity in the skies and on the ground must never be negotiable. If this journey touched you, please like, share, and subscribe. Because together, we can keep telling the stories that challenge, inspire, and demand a better tomorrow.